Talking gorilla exposes human secrets. Everyone was speechless. The early morning fog lingered like a veil over the San Francisco Zoo, softening the concrete contours of the gorilla enclosure and muffling the sounds of waking birds. A distant foghorn groaned over the bay as if heralding the birth of something quietly monumental. Behind thick glass and reinforced fencing, a newborn gorilla lay nestled against her mother's chest, her tiny fingers curled into delicate black spirals. Born on July 4, 1971, she was named Hanabiko, meaning fireworks child in Japanese, a nod both to her Independence Day birth and to the quiet spark in her solemn eyes. But no one could have imagined just how brightly that spark would one day burn. Across the city at Stanford University, a young graduate student named Francine Penny Patterson sat in the psychology department's lounge, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug. Her notebook was a patchwork of ideas, crossed-out terms, and theoretical musings on cognition and communication in primates. She had long been fascinated by the question, could a non-human animal use human language? The idea had once belonged strictly to the realm of science fiction or fringe psychology, yet Penny believed it could be more. When she heard of the baby, gorilla delicate, observant, and already captivating, the keepers with her calm, something within her shifted. Arrangements were made. The zoo, open to new ideas and eager for collaboration, allowed Penny to begin visiting the infant daily. The first time Penny saw Hanabiko, the infant clung to her mother's chest like a pearl embedded in onyx, but her wide eyes were unmistakably aware. Penny crouched low, still as a stone, and simply watched. For weeks, this was the rhythm, silent observation, patient proximity, and an unfolding bond. Eventually, Penny began introducing her hands, moving slowly, signing in American Sign Language, just simple words at first: eat, more, drink, love. By the time the gorilla turned one, she was moved to a more private environment where Penny could devote herself fully to what would become one of the most remarkable linguistic experiments in animal history. They called her Koko, a shortened, affectionate form of her name. What began as a student's experiment soon transformed into something profoundly more intimate, a shared journey between species. A language bridge forged not of syntax and grammar alone, but of empathy, affection, and the unspoken hum of trust. At first, progress was slow. Koko would watch Penny's hands with the same curiosity she gave to fluttering moths or rustling leaves. But one spring morning, something changed. Penny signed eat, and Koko reached out, touching her own mouth. It wasn't just mimicry, it was recognition. A dawning, a beginning. From there, the signs began to flow like sap from a thawed tree. Milk, ball, play, sad. Words layered with meaning. Koko was not just copying, she was conversing. Her hands stumbled at first, much like a toddler learning speech. But Penny watched with growing awe as this small gorilla grasped concepts beyond simple wants. She expressed affection, she teased, she even, astonishingly, told lies. What startled the scientific community more than her growing vocabulary over 200 words in time was Koko's emotional depth. When her favorite stuffed animal tore, she signed sad and gently cradled its limp form. She named her kitten All Ball because, as she told Penny, it resembled a fuzzy ball. Koko cared for All Ball as tenderly as a mother might, and when the kitten died in a tragic accident, Koko signed repeatedly, bad, sad, cry, trouble. She withdrew for days, refusing to play, barely eating. She mourned. In those quiet days, Penny saw firsthand what most had denied for generations: that animals, especially our close primate cousins, feel deeply, grieve genuinely, and love fully. She sat by Koko's side as the gorilla gently fingered the empty blanket where All Ball once lay, her hand tracing memories in the folds. Koko signed Sleep Cat over and over, and then saw heartbreakingly. Cat gone. The world took notice, news crews came, psychologists debated, skeptics scoffed, but the footage didn't lie. a gorilla signing her pain, her affection, her questions. When asked where gorillas go when they die, Koko signed back comfortable whole. By. Was it mimicry, or was it something deeper? Harder to define, an attempt to name the void, Koko grew from a curious infant into a wise and expressive adult. Her stature commanding, yet her spirit gentle. Her daily routines included painting, often using deliberate brushstrokes and swirling colors that seemed to reflect her moods. She played pranks, inventing her own signs like elephant for a group of birds she disliked. She laughed an unmistakable hooting giggle when Penny tickled her, or when she herself instigated a joke. The line between human and animal blurred in those moments. Language, once considered a solely human dominion, seemed suddenly less exclusive. Yet, for all the joy ends breakthrough, the journey was not without weight. The responsibility of translating Koko's world to human understanding fell heavily on Penny. Critics challenged the interpretations, questioning whether Koko truly grasped the semantics of language or merely associated signs with outcomes. But Penny knew better. She saw the difference between a command and a conversation, between mimicry and meaning. In time, Koko's sanctuary became more than a lab, it became a home. The Gorilla Foundation, co-founded by Penny, ensured she lived in peace, surrounded by people who adored her. Over the years, other animals came into her circle: kittens, even other gorillas, though she never formed the same connection with them as she had with her humans. In private moments, Penny and Koko would sign back and forth like sisters or old friends. Koko would ask for tickles, then abruptly change the subject to juice, then sign love with a soft grin curling her lips. One afternoon, Koko watched a documentary on environmental destruction, footage of forest fires and homeless animals flickering on the screen. When asked what she thought, Koko signed in Fix Earth, Help Earth, Hurry. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. A plea from a creature who once knew only a concrete cage and who now understood far more than the world had once believed possible. And so the gorilla who had been born on a day of fireworks, who had once trembled in the arms of her mother beneath the noise of captive life, became a voice not just for gorillas, but for the entire natural world. Through her hands, the wild had spoken, but this was just the beginning. In the chapters to come, Koko's story would travel from quiet enclosures to international headlines, from laughter and grief to a legacy etched into the soul of science, in the beating heart of those who believed in spite of everything that compassion crosses all boundaries. Years drifted by in a rhythm familiar to the coastal fog and redwood shadows that cloaked the Gorilla Foundation's sanctuary in Woodside, California. Koko, now maturing into full adulthood, no longer bore the curious clumsiness of a youngster. Her massive frame moved with calm certainty, each gesture thoughtful, each glance laden with unspoken meaning. She had grown into her body with a grace that belied her strength, and though she could have uprooted trees or shattered walls with ease, her touch remained impossibly gentle, especially when turning the pages of her picture books or cradling the soft head of a kitten in her massive palm. Penny Patterson had dedicated her life to this moment, to the shaping of a bridge between species that was held together not by language alone, but by love. The Gorilla Foundation was no longer a speculative project. It had become a haven where an entirely new form of communication was blooming, and Koko, the fireworks child, had become its brilliant flame. Each morning began the same way, with Koko waking in her sunlit enclosure, stretching with a low purr-like hum, and then greeting Penny with signs for morning, tickle, and milk. She delighted in these rituals. The mundane, to Koko, was not boring. It was comfort. Predictability meant safety, and within that safety, she could explore the unpredictable spaces of imagination. Often, after breakfast, she would sign for book, and Penny would retrieve her favorites, ones filled with pictures of animals, babies, and anything that resembled family. Koko would turn the pages with a furrowed brow, sometimes signing observations: elephant big, baby cry, cat happy. Penny always watched these sessions with quiet reverence, scribbling notes, recording signs, but never interrupting the current of Koko's thought unless invited. Yet for all her routines, Koko was unpredictable in the most beautiful ways. One morning, she paused while watching a bird through the glass, then turned and signed. Bird fly sad. Penny blinked, unsure why is the bird sad? Koko, she asked gently. Koko signed again. Bird no home. Bird want hug. Penny felt a ripple in her chest. It was not just the syntax broken but clear. It was the empathy, the capacity to imagine another's emotional state. This was not rote learning. This was awareness. As Koko's vocabulary grew, so too did her desire for connection. Her signs became more expressive, her sentences longer, often tinged with playfulness or surprising introspection. She joked, sometimes at Penny's expense, calling her toilet dirty after a rushed trip to the bathroom. Once, when offered carrots instead of her favorite apple, she signed, Koko sad, apple better, apple love. These moments delighted Penny and challenged those who still insisted that Koko's use of language was nothing more than operant conditioning. But even more startling were the times Koko went silent not because she lacked something to say, but because she was absorbing, feeling, processing. Silence, for her, was not absence. It was presence. That year, when Penny introduced Koko to a small gray kitten, the one who would later be known as Allball, something extraordinary occurred. Koko had often asked for a baby. She would sign baby, point to pictures of gorilla infants, then touch her chest and sign Koko baby. But she had no mate, and the logistics of artificial insemination were daunting. When the kitten was placed in her care, she reacted as if the deepest ache in her had finally softened. Koko cradled the kitten against her chest with infinite tenderness. She signed cat, then soft, good cat, and finally, all ball. Penny was puzzled. Why all ball, she asked. Koko pointed to the kitten's rounded body, mimicking its shape with her hands. All ball. She insisted. The name stuck. From that day forward, Koko treated all ball as her child, her companion, and perhaps the most real fulfillment of the motherhood she longed for but could not physically achieve. She groomed the kitten, carried it gently, and signed frequently about her. Koko loved Ball, Ball happy, Koko hugged Ball. Their bond was instant and inseparable. But life, even for a creature as cherished as Koko, is never free of loss. One morning, while the staff was preparing breakfast, All Ball darted out of the enclosure through a slight gap in the door. No one noticed until it was too late. The sound of screeching tires outside the sanctuary broke the morning's peace. When they found the kitten's lifeless body near the road, Penny's hands trembled as she gathered it up. How could she explain this? How could she prepare Koko for death when Koko saw Penny returning without All Ball alive? She knew. Her chest heaved. She signed frantically. Ball hurt. Ball sleep. Penny signed back slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. Ball dead. Ball no come back. Koko stared. Her sign slowed. Her body seemed to shrink beneath the weight of understanding. She turned her back, huddled into the corner of her enclosure, and signed, sad, bad, cry. Then she wept not in the way of humans, but with low, mournful moans, her massive shoulders trembling as she rocked back and forth. For days she signed and Ball gone. Sometimes she blamed others. Stupid man. Sometimes she begged for return, bring Ball. But mostly she grieved. The world watched, and headlines spread like wind through grass. Gorilla mourns kitten. Scientists, skeptics, psychologists all took sides. Was it grief or mimicry? Could an animal understand the permanence of death? But for those who saw Koko daily, there was no question. She knew, she felt, she remembered. Over time, the ache softened. As all losses do, Koko accepted another kitten, but none ever filled the same place in her heart as All Ball. Yet even in loss, she found language. She began to sign about hurt inside and Koko cry sleep. Penny once watched her sit alone in the enclosure, rocking a toy and murmuring softly. When asked what she was doing, Koko signed, Koko talk baby, Koko mama. It was then Penny realized that language, for Koko was not a performance. It was survival, a way to carve meaning into the silence. And Coco's ability to do so, to sit between two worlds and give voice to both, was nothing short of extraordinary. As the seasons changed and the redwoods rustled with early autumn winds, Penny knew that Coco had become more than the subject of a study. She had become a teacher, a mirror held up to humanity. Every time Coco reached out with her broad, expressive hands and signed ball of love, she was asking the world a question. If I can feel this, why don't you believe it? It was a question still echoing, unanswered, in the hearts of those who refused to see. But for Penny, and for all who came to know Koko, the answer had already been spoken without words, yet louder than any language could hold. The rain had returned to the quiet sanctuary, tapping gently against the skylight panels that dotted the roof of Koko's enclosure. It wasn't a loud rain, nor a storming kind that unsettled her. It was soft, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. Koko sat on her padded bench by the window, her eyes following the streaks of water as they curled down the glass. She was older now, her back a bit stiffer, her movements slower, but no less deliberate. Her face had matured into a gentler solemnity, the lines of age carving a dignified calm into her features. Penny sat nearby, her ever-present notepad resting on her lap, though these days she wrote less and simply watched. The years had stitched them together like thread and fabric, inseparable, worn and comforting. Penny had become less the researcher and more the companion, the interpreter of a soul that never ceased to surprise her. Koko turned to her now, her dark eyes thoughtful, and signed slowly. People pointed that. Why people hurt Earth. Penny's hand paused above the page. It wasn't the first time Koko had asked something like this, but every time she did, it broke through the haze of ordinary conversation like a gong. Koko had watched videos, read books with her fingers, absorbed the world's grief through television, through images of burning forests and melting ice, animals displaced and dying. She didn't just see them, she felt them. And then she would ask questions like this. I don't know, Penny said softly. The answer never enough. Koko nodded as if she expected that. Then, with slow, heavy movements, she signed again. Fix Earth. Hurry. Help Earth. Penny nodded, her throat tightening. Koko had always displayed a sensitivity that bordered on prophetic, as though her view of the world came not just from what she saw, but from something deeper, an emotional resonance that human beings often dulled in themselves in order to cope. But Koko never dulled it. She felt everything. When one of the sanctuary's dogs passed away that year, an old beagle named Max, Koko had gone silent for 3 days. She refused to eat at first, her signs turning inward, vague and haunted. Penny found her sitting in her enclosure, holding Max's leash in her lap, slowly stroking the worn leather with the same care she used when grooming kittens. When Penny tried to comfort her, Koko signed simply, Dog sleep long time, no more Max, sad inside. It wasn't just the grief that stirred people, it was the depth of her comprehension. Koko understood gone. She understood never again. She didn't just mimic sadness. She inhabited it. That autumn, a documentary crew from Europe came to visit the sanctuary. They had followed Koko's story for years and wanted to create a piece not just on her intelligence, but on her message, a message they claimed was bigger than science, bigger even than the miracle of language. It was about empathy. They asked Penny if Koko would respond to a message about Earth, about humans, pollution, deforestation, and extinction. Penny hesitated at first. Koko was not a trained SEAL. She wasn't a puppet of public emotion. She was a person, in her own right, and Penny had always protected her dignity fiercely. But then Koko herself answered the question, when shown a video of oil-covered birds, flattened rainforests, and starving polar bears. Koko turned to the camera, furrowed her brow, and signed, Man, stupid. Man, bad. Fix Earth. Help now. Hurry. The crew froze. Penny held her breath. Koko stared into the lens, her fingers moving again. Koko said, Nature cry. Koko love Earth. People must fix. It was a plea not just from a gorilla who had learned signs, but from a sentient being whose voice rose from the gap between species to touch something ancient and aching within us all. The footage aired across the world. Millions watched the large silverback female, seated like a wise elder, her dark eyes serious, her hands speaking a truth no language barrier could hide. She wasn't just using words. She was shaping meaning, calling out to humanity from the silent wilderness it had long ignored. In the weeks that followed, letters poured in, children writing to Koko in crayon scrawl, activists quoting her signs at protests, teachers using her message in classrooms. And yet, not everyone believed. Skeptics dismissed the display as manipulation, anthropomorphism, projection. They said Koko was only responding to cues, that her signs were clever mimicry trained by reward. Penny never argued back in fury. She had long accepted that some minds resist what challenges their dominance. But she had seen too much to ever doubt. She had seen Koko sign cry when her kitten died, even when alone. She had watched her make jokes no one taught her, mourn lives she hadn't known, and invent new signs for emotions no human had tried to label for her. Fake was not a word that fit Koko. One rainy evening, long after the camera crews had gone, Koko and Penny sat by the fireplace in the living quarters. The sanctuary was quiet except for the occasional chirp of frogs and the soft creak of settling wood. Koko was pensive, running her fingers through the fur of a stuffed rabbit. She looked at Penny and signed, Koko old, Penny sad someday. Penny blinked, her chest tightening. Yes, she said quietly, one day, but happy now. Koko signed, Koko love Penny, Penny good. No cry, no cry. Penny agreed, blinking back the tears anyway. They had grown old together. Koko, though still powerful and dignified, moved more slowly now. Her joints ached on cold days, and her appetite had lessened. But her mind was bright. She asked questions about the moon, about babies, about why birds fly away. She loved hearing lullabies, especially when sung softly and without words. And sometimes she would hum along a deep, chesty vibration, like a lullaby made of thunder. One day, Penny brought her a mirror, something they hadn't used often in recent years. Koko gazed into it for a long time, her eyes scanning her own reflection, her fingers gently touching the surface. Then she signed Koko Gray. Koko slow, Koko remember ball, Koko still love. Penny whispered, I remember too. The mirror stayed in the room after that, not for vanity but for reflection, not just physical, but soulful. Koko would often sit before it in the early hours, watching the slow dawn creep across her face, and sometimes she would sign to her own reflection, as though speaking to the person she was and the being she had become. She understood time, she understood change, and she embraced both with the quiet courage of one who had learned to carry loss without being lost. That winter, when a storm knocked out power to part of the sanctuary, Koko huddled close to Penny by candlelight. She signed dark OK, Koko not alone, Koko safe, and she was, in her own words, in her own way. Koko had built a home inside the hearts of those who listened not with speech, but with meaning, with signs not only of language, but of presence, of grace. And somewhere beyond the rain-streaked glass and the silence between species, the world tilted just a little toward compassion, because one gorilla had dared to speak, and we had dared, for once, to listen. The wind swept softly across the redwoods that stood like sentinels around the sanctuary, their towering trunks bathed in golden light as morning broke through a sky painted with pale peach and silver. It was one of those serene California mornings that arrived not with grandeur, but with a quiet presence, as if the earth were whispering rather than speaking. Within the sanctuary, the air hung heavy with stillness. Koko had woken later than usual, her massive body curled into a crescent of fur and breath on the blanket-lined platform she favored, when her bones ached more than usual. Penny had sat nearby for hours, reading softly from a book of poems, not for comprehension, but for comfort. her voice threading through the room like a lullaby only two souls could understand. Koko stirred only once, signing weakly, "Listen, poem," and then closing her eyes again. There was something sacred in the way the moment lingered, suspended in the hush of waiting. Penny knew. She didn't need a doctor or a chart to explain the truth. The signs had come slowly over months: the longer naps, the reduced appetite, the increasing time spent just watching the sky or gazing into the mirror without signing a word. Koko had entered a place beyond speech, not out of loss, but perhaps out of completion. There was a grace in her withdrawal, a settling. The once playful hands that had signed hundreds of words now moved less frequently, not out of forgetfulness, but as though words were no longer required between her and the world she had once tried so hard to reach. The sanctuary staff moved quietly, respecting the quietude that had settled like mist around them. They kept her taramom, brought her favorite fruits sliced into thin wedges, and played recordings of lullabies and forest sounds. Penny never left her side. At night, she slept in a chair just beside Koko's bed, her hands sometimes resting against the gorilla's fur, grounding herself in the soft rhythm of her breath. She often found herself whispering memories of the first sign, of the kitten named Allball, of Koko's laughter when Penny once tripped during a yoga session and landed in a heap of mats. Koko had signed Silly Penny and clapped her hands, shaking with silent mirth. Penny would smile at the memory, but always with tears close behind. On the third day of Koko's retreat into near silence, Penny brought a mirror once again, placing it before her gently. Koko's eyes flicked open, finding her own reflection with the gaze of someone not startled by age or wear, but curious. Slowly, she raised one large finger to the glass, touching her own cheek, then turned her head to meet Penny's eyes. After a moment of stillness, she signed, "Koko old. Koko remember baby. Love ball. Love Penny. Love Earth." The signs were slow, her fingers trembling slightly, but the meaning was unmistakable. Penny's breath caught. She reached for Koko's hand and held it to her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much." Koko closed her eyes again. That night, the stars emerged one by one through the canopy above the sanctuary, flickering between branches like small, ancient eyes. Penny stayed awake, watching the rise and fall of Koko's breath, memorizing the rhythm, knowing that even if she watched it for 1,000 more years, it would never be enough. The moon passed overhead, slow and silent. At 2:15 a.m., Koko's breath stilled. It was as gentle as a leaf falling to earth, as quiet as the moment between heartbeats. There was no struggle, only peace. Her massive frame relaxed, her lips parted slightly, and then she simply didn't return. Penny sat there long after, unable to speak, unable to move, her hands still wrapped in Koko's. The room seemed to pulse with memory, the air thick with decades of unspoken conversations, of signs exchanged, of laughter, of sorrow, of everything they had been together. Word of Koko's passing spread swiftly through the world. News anchors, activists, teachers, and even world leaders paused to acknowledge the loss. But it wasn't just the death of a gorilla. It was the passing of a soul who had redefined what it meant to be heard. Vigils sprang up in unexpected places. Children in classrooms drew pictures of Koko with hearts and stars and signed messages of love in trembling fingers. Scientists who had once doubted her capabilities wrote op-eds about the importance of emotional intelligence in animals. And Penny grieved with a stillness that went beyond weeping. The house she had once shared with her lifelong friend now felt impossibly vast, as if Koko's presence had always filled every room. And now her absence echoed in the corners like forgotten music. But the grief was not hollow. It was vast. Yes, but rich with meaning. Penny found solace in the letters, in the videos that circulated once more: Koko hugging a kitten, signing "I am sad," tickling Penny's feet and laughing, asking for her baby, pleading for Earth. She was more than a gorilla. She was a philosopher in fur, a bridge between species, a presence who had spoken not just with hands, but with heart. The sanctuary chose to honor her with a simple ceremony. No cages, No fanfare, just a circle of those who knew her best, standing beneath the redwoods, reading from the journal entries and video transcripts that captured her most poignant moments. Penny stood last, a small wooden box in her hands. It contained a lock of Coco's fur, a small stuffed all-ball replica, and a folded page where Koko had once signed, in her own careful order, Koko love Earth, fix Earth, love good. Penny spoke softly. She taught us to listen not just to each other, but to the life that surrounds us, not with superiority, with humility, with awe. She paused. She wanted us to help this world, not later, now, and with trembling hands, she placed the box beneath the roots of an old redwood, where moss already stretched like a velvet blanket. The tree would hold her now. In the weeks that followed, the sanctuary adjusted to the silence. Birds still sang, leaves still fell, but every movement seemed to carry the shadow of a hand that had once reached across the barrier of species and signed love into the air. Penny returned to her work, though it felt different now, less about research, more about remembrance. She began compiling every transcript, every video, every signed message Koko had ever given, into a book not of data but of testimony, a witness to the life of a being who had challenged the boundaries of language, intelligence, and empathy. She titled it When the Silence Speaks, the Life of Koko. One afternoon, a group of children came to the sanctuary, invited for an educational day. They gathered in the room where Koko used to sit. Penny watched them enter, fidgeting with curiosity and awe. She brought out the mirror, placed it before them, and asked a simple question: when you look into this mirror, what do you see? The children offered answers. Me, a kid, a girl with glasses. Then Penny asked, what do you think Koko saw? Silence. Then a small voice from the back, a friend. Penny smiled. Yes, she saw a friend, and she wanted to be yours. The sun filtered through the trees again, and for a moment, it felt as though Koko was still there, just beyond the light, just outside the words, smiling in that deep, knowing way she had, a presence woven into the wind, into the leaves, into the silence that would never be empty again. Because once, a gorilla spoke, and we listened. The days after Koko's passing unfolded like pages of a quiet book, the kind with more space between sentences than dialogue, where the meaning lived not just in the words, but in the pauses. Penny moved through the sanctuary like a caretaker of memory rather than a scientist now, her steps slower, more deliberate, as if each one stirred echoes. The enclosure stood mostly untouched. Koko's favorite blanket, faded from years of sun and washing, remained folded in the corner. Her mirror, with a faint smudge from one of her last touches, caught the morning light and scattered it in quiet beams across the room. No one dared to clean it too thoroughly. It was not out of superstition, but reverence, a desire to hold on, even briefly, to the traces of something unrepeatable. Penny would often sit there, in the room where Koko had signed her first word and her last, hands clasped in her lap, eyes searching the still air as if she might catch the shape of her old friend in the drift of sunlight or the whisper of breeze. Koko was gone. Yes, but the space she had occupied had not emptied, it had expanded. The foundation had begun receiving visitors in increasing numbers. They came not to see a gorilla, but to witness the place where an ancient truth had found form in fur and fingers, that language was not the gatekeeper of humanity, and emotion did not ask for species to take root. Visitors walked through the sanctuary quietly, touching the railings, peering through the windows, reading plaques about Koko's milestones. Many wept. Children signed her name with small, careful hands. One little girl, no older than Baiden, sat on the ground near Koko's mirror and whispered, I brought my bear to show her. She placed a small, worn teddy at the base of the glass. Penny crouched beside her, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She would have loved that, she said softly. She always loved when children visited. In the months that followed, Penny took to writing late into the night. Her journals, once methodical and clinical, became more fluid, filled with meditations rather than measurements. She wrote about the way Koko would stare at the stars and sign me Look Sky, about how she had once asked for a pet dog and insisted on naming it Dog Baby, or the time she signed Koko afraid after watching a thunderstorm and then leaned into Penny's shoulder like a child might. These memories formed a tapestry too wide to fold away. She knew they had to be shared, not just archived in dusty drawers, but spoken aloud, passed hand to hand like sacred stories. So she began the process of gathering everything: footage, transcripts, sketches, photos, voice recordings. And in doing so, she found Koko again, not as a subject or even as a friend, but as a voice that continued to ripple across hearts. The foundation decided to create a public memorial garden in Koko's honor, a space where people could come not just to mourn, but to reflect. It would not be a place of tears alone, but of planting, of growth, of shared connection. Volunteers helped shape it, a winding path through flowering shrubs and native plants, ending in a circular clearing with a low stone bench and a bronze statue of Koko seated cross-legged, her right hand raised mid-sign for love. Around her, the ground was soft earth, open to offerings. Visitors brought everything: drawings, letters, flowers, even bananas with little notes tied around them. One had read simply, "Thank you for showing me that animals feel the same as we do. I promise to be kind." Penny visited the garden often. She would sit beside the statue, close her eyes, and listen not for signs or ghosts, but for the truth that still moved beneath the surface of the world, the one Koko had tried so hard to share. Sometimes she thought of the night they had watched a documentary together, one that showed war and suffering. Koko had signed Trouble People, then Fix. Later, in a moment Penny never recorded because she was too overcome, Koko had turned to her and signed Koko Love People. People forget love. And Penny had no answer then, only tears. But now, sitting in the garden, she believed Koko had been right. People didn't stop loving. They just forgot how to show it. And sometimes it took a gorilla to remind them. Letters continued to arrive. One was from a soldier overseas who wrote, "Watching Koko gave me a reason to be gentle again." Another from a child who had been nonverbal for years. "I use signs like Koko now. Mommy cries, but it's happy." From an elderly man. "She changed my heart when nothing else could." Koko's story had become more than a curiosity. It had become a language of its own, a quiet, enduring call to remember what empathy looked like when stripped of pride and pretense. Penny decided to give one last talk. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, her voice not quite as strong, but her presence radiated something deeper, an earned stillness, a gravity born from decades spent listening to the quietest voices. She stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, the screen behind her glowing with images of Koko's life. The room was silent. Then she began. "We taught her signs," Penny said softly, "but she taught us meaning. We gave her words. She gave us understanding." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "Koko didn't just mimic. She mourned. She loved. She forgave. She asked for kittens, for babies, for the world to be kind. She asked us to fix what we broke. She asked us to listen, and we did. Some of us, at least." She looked up, her eyes shining. "Koko once signed, 'Koko good gorilla.' But the truth is she was a good person, and I hope if we learn from her, we can be too." A pause, she never spoke a single word, but she said more than most ever do. The applause was quiet at first, then thunderous, rising to meet the ceiling, as if the room itself needed to echo what no language could truly hold. Afterward, a boy approached Penny, his hands moving slowly, deliberately. "Thank you, Koko. I love Koko." Penny knelt, signed it back. "Koko, love you too." And the boy smiled, tears in his eyes, and ran back to his parents. The sanctuary continued, not as a place of spectacle, but of education and connection. Children came to learn about sign language, about conservation, about compassion. They read stories about Koko and practiced her favorite signs play: hug, happy, love, and the mirror still stood in the room where she once lived. Visitors were invited to sit before it and sign something to themselves. Many chose love, others signed sorry, friend, or simply placed a hand against the glass and sat in silence. Years later, Penny passed away in her sleep. Her final journal left open to a page where she had written, "We searched for intelligence, but what we found was grace." They buried her near the garden, beneath a tree that flowered each spring. And beside her, etched in stone, were Coco's words, "Fix Earth, Coco love." And the world continued. The seasons changed. The redwoods stood. The air still held her echo. Because once, a gorilla had spoken. And not only did we listen, we remembered.